The wind in the Arizona Territory had teeth in late autumn, and in the year of 1888, it chewed on the high red rocks of Canyon Mercy with a particular vengeance. It carried the smell of iron and distant pine, and a silence that had settled deep in the bones of the land. Down below, the lights of Silver Mesa were just beginning to prick the dusk, a small cluster of hopeful sparks in a vast, indifferent bowl of stone. Above them, on the canyon's edge, Jude Callahan paid the lights no mind. His ranch was less a home than an anchor, a collection of timber and stone meant to hold one man in place. From his porch, the entire valley was a map of his isolation, and in the valley, he was a legend of the wrong kind. The talk in the saloons and the general store was always the same, whispered over dry goods and whiskey glasses. He's refused every woman in the county, every last one. They said it with a shake of the head, a mixture of pity for the women and a strange, grudging respect for the man's stubbornness. Jude Callahan was tall, built like the unforgiving rock he lived on, and his words were sparse, rationed like water in a drought. He'd had a lifetime's worth of talk burned out of him. His cabin stood exactly as it had 5 years prior, save for the barn, the new barn, smaller and rawer, stood over the black, scarred earth where the old one had burned. The fire had taken the horses, the hay, and his brother, Silas. The smoke of that night still coated the back of Jude's throat. The memory was a physical weight, a debt owed to a gang whose name was a curse, the Ragged Spurs. His hatred for them was not a passing storm, but the climate itself, clinging to him as stubbornly as the fine red dust that settled on every surface, inside and out. He couldn't rebuild his brother, so he rebuilt the forge. It was a small, three-sided shed tucked behind the cabin, its chimney breathing dark smoke against the crimson cliffs. This was where Jude lived. He'd taught himself the smith's trade, his inheritance of grief hammered into a new skill. He shoed horses for the few ranches stubborn enough to survive this high up. The clang, thud, hiss of steel was his only conversation, the ringing hammer his only prayer. It was the only rhythm that could drive the nightmares back into their holes, the only labor hard enough to grant him a few hours of flat, dreamless sleep. But something else had come to the canyon. For 3 weeks, just as the sun's first light breached the eastern ridge, it appeared, a wild white stallion, so pale it seemed assembled from mist and bone. It stood on the far peak, a statue against the new day, its mane and tail stirred by a wind only it could feel. The town had no name for it, but Jude called it Ghost Lantern. It would watch his cabin for a long minute, its breath steaming in the cold, and then it would turn and vanish, not running, but simply gone, as if the rock had swallowed it. It felt like an omen, a question Jude didn't know how to ask. The horse was a specter of a freedom he'd forgotten, and its presence both obsessed and unsettled him. It was the only living thing that seemed to understand the canyon's profound silence. Down in Prospector's Reach, the silence was bought and sold. Mrs. Tilda Crane, proprietor of the town's general store, was a woman who believed all empty spaces should be filled whether on her shelves or in a man's home. She was a relentless force of goodwill, and Jude was her greatest project. "Jude, honey, you can't live on jerky and beans forever," she'd call out as he laid his coins on the counter. "My niece, Elspeth, just arrived from Missouri, makes a fine apple pie, and she's got a gentle temperament." Jude would just nod, tipping his hat. "Flour, Mrs. Crane, and coffee. 50 pounds of flour. He needs a wife." "Not another sack of flour," she'd mutter to the other women in the store as he left, his broad back disappearing through the doorway. His polite, immovable refusals only fanned the flames of the gossip. He was a puzzle, and the town loved to turn him over in their hands. But another, darker rumor snaked through Silver Mesa, a whisper that had the sharp taste of fear. Judge Luther Pike. He was a landowner who wore a robe, a man who'd come to the territory with a smooth tongue and an iron grip. He'd decided there was silver under the dry farms and cattle ranches, and he intended to have it. Men who refused his low offers found their property lines disputed in Pike's own court. Wells suddenly failed. The law, in Pike's hands, became as effective as a hired gun. And there were rumors of those. 2 shadowy men who enforced the judge's quiet will when his gavel wasn't enough. Jude listened to this talk with the same stillness he gave everything else. But his eyes, when he heard Pike's name, went flat and hard. He knew the shape of men who took what wasn't theirs. The day the wind turned, it brought more than cold. It was the last week of October, and the sky had been a bruised, heavy gray since dawn. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed, driving pellets of ice and snow sideways. It was a day to stay inside, to feed the stove and check the window seals. It was the day she arrived. A simple wagon, its dark green paint faded and scarred, rolled into Canyon Mercy. It was not a local rig. The horses were lathered and exhausted, bowing their heads against the gale. The wagon pulled to a stop not by the house, but directly before the open-faced forge, where Jude was hammering a shoe into shape. He stopped, the hammer held aloft. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the wind and the panting of the horses. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped down. It was a woman, but she moved without the hesitation the terrain demanded. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, pulled low, and a heavy gray wool cloak that snapped and cracked in the wind. She slammed the door and walked directly toward him, toward the heat and the flying sparks, as if the storm at her back was of no consequence. She stopped just outside the circle of firelight. She was tall, though the cloak hid her shape. She pushed the hat back just enough for him to see her face. Dark brown hair, pulled back tight, though the wind had torn strands loose to whip across her cheeks. Her face was pale, set, and her eyes a clear, steady brown met his without flinching. There was no plea in them, no fear of the storm, no fear of the fire, and no fear of the large, silent man holding the hammer. "My name is Tamsin Vale," she said. Her voice was clear, not loud, but it cut through the shriek of the wind as if it had no right to interrupt. "I am coming from Santa Fe." She jerked her chin toward her wagon. The wind tore the words from her mouth, but he heard them all the same. "I have a cracked axle. It will not last another mile. I need it repaired. Immediately." Jude lowered the hammer, the metal ringing in the sudden quiet. He looked at the cracked axle, then at the woman. The wind whipped her gray cloak around her like a battle flag. "It's a bad split. Forging a new brace will take time," he said. His voice was rough, rusted from disuse. "Time is what the storm is taking. How long? 2 hours? Maybe 3, if the forge holds this wind." She looked at the sky, a ceiling of churning, dirty ice. She knew he was right. She gave a single, sharp nod. "I will pay for the rush," he grunted, turning his attention to the wagon. With movements that were economical and powerful, he began the work of freeing the heavy wheel, propping the axle on a block of cottonwood. Tamsin Vale did not retreat to the shelter of her wagon. She watched him. Her hands were clasped in front of her. But she was not praying. She was observing his technique, the way he managed the heavy lifting, his leverage. After half an hour of brutal work in the driving sleet, he had the axle free and resting near the forge. The metal was already freezing. "You can wait in the cabin," he said, not looking at her. It was not an invitation. It was a command to get out of his workspace. "Don't touch the stove." He disappeared into the forge, and the rhythmic clang of his hammer began again, a defiant pulse against the storm's roar. Tamsin walked to the cabin. The door hinge protested with a sound like a hawk's cry. She stepped inside and pushed it shut, the latch clicking home. The sudden silence was heavy, thick, broken only by the moan of the wind in the chimney. The single room was cold, but the air was still. It smelled of wood smoke, old coffee, and saddle leather. Her eyes, accustomed to the bright snowlight, adjusted slowly to the gloom. It was, as the town rumor might have guessed, a room devoid of softness. A single cot, blankets folded, a swept plank floor, a rifle, meticulously cleaned, resting on wall pegs. It was stark, but it was not dirty. It was the precise, ordered loneliness of a man who fights chaos by controlling the few things he can. Her gaze traveled to the mantelpiece over the cold hearth. There was no clutter, Just one object, placed in the center. A man's handkerchief, once fine linen, now scorched black along the edges and through the middle. It was folded, but the burn holes were visible. It was the only thing in the entire cabin that was not useful. It was a wound left on display. Tamsin looked at it for a full minute, her expression unchanging. She understood shrines. She understood the things that were too heavy to carry, yet impossible to set down. She did not touch it. She turned away just as Jude entered, his arms loaded with fresh-cut juniper. He dumped the wood by the stove, sparing her only a glance. He expected to find her huddled, shivering, perhaps weeping. She was standing by his small table, her cloak unbuttoned, her gaze steady. "The wind is turning," she said. "Not a complaint, just a fact." He nodded, feeding wood into the cast-iron stove. "It will get worse before it gets better." He returned to the forge. Tamsin stayed in the cabin, an alien presence in his sanctuary. He could feel her watching from the window. It made the muscles in his back tighten. When the work was finally done, nearly 3 hours later, the world outside was a shrieking void of white. He had forged a new brace, thick and functional, welding it to the axle with clean, strong seams. He cooled the metal, the hiss sounding final. He carried the heavy piece to the wagon, Tamsin emerging from the cabin to meet him. She held a lantern, though its light barely penetrated the swirling snow. She inspected the repair, running a gloved finger along the new weld. Jude watched, annoyed. "It's clean work," she said, her voice raised over the storm. Strong, no showing off. Jude paused. He'd been paid in coin, in tobacco, sometimes in grudging silence. He had never been paid in professional respect. He didn't know what to do with it. He just grunted and moved to fit the axle back onto the wagon. "They talk about you in Prospector's Reach," she called out, holding the light steady for him. Towns talk. He was leveraging the wheel back on, his muscles straining. "They say you've refused every woman in the county." The wheel slid home with a heavy thud. Jude stood up, breathing hard. He looked at her. The lantern light caught the ice crystals in her hair. It was not a flirtation. It was an interrogation. "I need horses that can stand the winter, ma'am," he said, his voice flat and cold as the iron in his hand. "Not a proposal." She held his gaze, refusing to be dismissed. "Some people think you need both to survive out here. I'm surviving." He wiped his hands on an oiled rag. "That'll be $3. For the labor and the storm tax." Tamsin reached inside her cloak, retrieving a small leather purse. She pulled out the coins and held them out to him. Her glove was off. Her hand was bare, pale, and steady. When he took the silver, his calloused skin brushed hers. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice suddenly quiet, forcing him to lean closer to hear her over the wind. "You want a wife? Or just a winter alone?" The question hit him like a physical blow. It was too sharp, too precise. It was the question he'd been asking himself in the dark hours before dawn. The question the wind howled at him every night. It wasn't gossip. It was judgment. He had no answer. He just stared at her, the $3 silver heavy in his palm. He clenched his fist, the metal biting into his skin, and turned his back on her. He stalked toward the barn to get his own horses inside, a dismissal more profound than any word. He half expected her to follow, to argue, to demand shelter. He heard only the creak of the wagon as she climbed back into the driver's seat. He finished with his horse, latched the barn door, and turned back to the cabin, bracing himself against the gale. He stopped. The wagon was still there. The horses were huddling, heads down, but she hadn't taken the reins. "The axle is fixed. Mr. Callahan," she yelled, "but the road is gone. I can't see 10 feet. The horses won't move into that wind." He knew it was true. The switchbacks down to Silver Mesa would be a sheet of ice, a graveyard trap. He felt a surge of violent resentment. He wanted this woman gone. He wanted his solitude back. He yanked open the cabin door. "The wagon stays. Put your horses in the barn. You take the cot, I'll take the floor." He didn't wait for a reply, just slammed the door. leaving her to fight the storm and unhitch her team. His house was no longer his. Darkness fell, and the storm descended. Inside the cabin, the silence was a coiled snake. Tamsin sat on the cot. Jude sat on the floor by the stove, cleaning his rifle. The shing, shing, shing of the cleaning rod the only sound. Her question hung in the air between them, unspoken. A winter alone, miles away, in the smoke-filled warmth of the Mercury Lantern saloon. The mood was loud. Rory Finch, a man who wore his gun high and his loyalty to Judge Luther Pike on his sleeve, slammed his whiskey glass on the bar. "Heard some news today." "Boys," Finch announced to the room. "A certain troublesome widow just rolled into the territory. Name of Tamsin Vale." A cattleman nearby grunted. "What's she want?" Finch smiled. A slow, ugly expression. "She's sniffing around the old Wellspring property. Thinks she has a claim, coming all the way from Santa Fe." He laughed, and two other men at his table laughed with him. "The judge owns that water now, and the judge keeps what's his. She'd be smart to keep right on riding." The name Wellspring, spoken in the saloon, echoed in the high, silent canyon. Jude Callahan didn't need to hear the gossip. He knew the name Wellspring. It was the patch of land bordering his own, the place where the deep underground rivers surfaced before vanishing again. It was the reason the entire valley could survive the dry season. And he knew one other thing. The night the ragged spurs burned his barn and killed his brother, they hadn't just been stealing horses. Their leader had been drunk, shouting at his men, furious. "Find the maps," he'd yelled. "The water maps. The boss wants the water." Jude hadn't understood it then. He did now. His brother hadn't died for a horse. He'd died for the Wellspring. Jude looked across the shadowed cabin at the woman sitting on his cot. Tamsin Vale. She was not just a stranger caught in a storm. She was the match. And she had just walked into a canyon full of dry powder. The wind outside screamed, and it sounded like his brother's last cry. The storm did not break. It settled in, a siege of ice and wind that erased the world. Shrinking it to the four walls of the cabin, the temperature plummeted, and the wind found every crack in the chinking. Jude brought in a mountain of firewood, his arms straining. He stacked it by the stove, his movements precise, ignoring her presence. Tamsin, shedding her damp cloak, took stock of his kitchen, a tin of coffee, half a sack of flour, salt, and a large bag of pinto beans. It was the larder of a man who eats to fuel the next day's work. "Nothing more. You have a pot," she stated. He nodded toward a heavy iron Dutch oven by the hearth. Without asking, she took it. She rinsed beans, her movements quick and efficient, and found a slab of salt pork hanging from a rafter. Jude watched her out of the corner of his eye as he split kindling, the sharp thwack of his hatchet the only sound. She handled his skinning knife to cube the pork, her grip comfortable, familiar. She added water from his bucket, set the pot on the stove, and then, as if it were her own home, took a seat at the small table, the cabin filled with the sounds of their separate labors, his splitting wood, her stirring the pot, the wind screaming for entry, the stove crackling its defiance. The air, which had been sharp with cold and loneliness, began to thicken with the rich, savory smell of cooking beans and juniper smoke. It was a domesticity so foreign it felt like a trespass. Then, a new sound, a steady drip, drip, drip from the far corner. Jude sighed, the sound heavy with exhaustion. A roof leak. He stood, looking for a bucket. "Don't waste a bucket," Tamsin said. She was already on her feet, staring at the ceiling plank where the water was darkening the wood. "It's a small split, probably from the ice. Do you have pine resin and a clean rag?" He pointed to a tin on his workbench. "In there. For ceiling tack." She retrieved it, along with a fresh rag from his meager pile. She didn't ask for help. She dragged the heavy table under the leak, climbed onto it, and held the lantern high with one hand, inspecting the crack. She used his knife to clear the split, then deftly, carefully, worked the thick, sticky resin into the wood, pressing it deep with her thumb. She finished by wedging the rag tightly into the gap. She was strong, and she was not afraid of heights or of hard work, but it was the way she tied off the rag, her fingers moving in a blur. That caught his eye. It was a fast-release slip knot, the kind a cavalryman or a stage driver would use, someone who might need to free a line in a hurry. With one pull. It was the knot of a person who never expected to stay tied for long. She climbed down, wiping her sticky hands on her trousers. That will hold through the storm. Jude just nodded, his gaze lingering on the knot. They ate the soup later. In near silence, it was hot, thick, and nourishing. The warmth spread through Jude's chest, a feeling so acute it was almost painful. It had been 5 years since a hot meal he hadn't made himself had been served in this room. He set his spoon down. Wellspring. It's more than just old family land. Tamsin looked up, her face partially shadowed in the lamplight. Yes, Pike's man. Finch is already warning people off you, calling you a troublesome widow. Her spoon stopped. I am Tamsin Vale. I was, for a short and terrible time. Tamsin Pike. It was a marriage under duress. It was annulled in Santa Fe. He does not see it that way. The name Pike landed in the room like a chunk of ice. So you've come back to fight a judge, in his own territory, for land he already controls. Alone. That was the plan, she said simply. It's a fool's plan. He'll have you run out or buried before the ground thaws. He will certainly try, she said. She met his gaze, and there was no fear in her, only a cold, hard calculation, which is why my question from earlier was not idle talk. Mr. Callahan. Jude went still. What question? About a wife? Or a winter alone? He stared at her, the resentment returning, sharp and hot. I am not for hire, and I am not looking for a wife. I am not looking for a husband, she countered, her voice as flat as his. I am looking for a shield. Pike is a bully, but he is a bully who respects the law when it suits him. He will harass a lone woman. He will threaten her, try to buy her, and if that fails, he will have her removed. But a married woman, a woman married to a local landowner, a man with a name in this valley, that is a different matter. It complicates his paperwork. It makes the fight public. Jude pushed his chair back, the legs scraping the floor. You want to hide behind my name? I want to rent your name, she corrected him, her voice precise. A business arrangement. We ride to Prospect's Reach when the storm breaks. We file the papers. A winter marriage. It gives me the time I need, the standing I need, to file my claim on Wellspring. When the spring comes and the passes are clear, I ride back to Santa Fe and I file for annulment. You are a free man, exactly as you were, and I will pay you for your trouble. He walked to the window, turning his back to her, and stared into the swirling blackness. He thought of the ragged spurs. He thought of the words the boss wants the water. This woman, this Tamsin Vale, was not just poking a bear. She was trying to steal its cub, and she was asking him to stand in the cave with her. His first instinct, his 5-year-old habit, was to say no. To throw her out! But he heard his brother's voice, shouting in the fire. He thought of Pike, getting rich off the land that was soaked in his family's blood. Terms, he said, his voice a low growl. Tamsin let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He turned to face her. We set terms. First, no lies, not about the big things. You tell me everything about Pike, everything about Wellspring. I will not be shot in the back for a secret you kept. Agreed, she said instantly. Second, what is mine remains mine. What is yours remains yours. Her eyes flicked to the scorched handkerchief on the mantel. We do not touch each other's ghosts without permission. Agreed, Jude said. Third, she continued, this is paper. We are 2 people sheltering from a storm. Nothing more is expected. Nothing more is offered. Agreed. He walked back to the table, towering over her. And last, no one forces anyone to forget the dead. This arrangement is for the living. The dead stay where they are. The dead stay where they are, she affirmed, rising from her chair to stand opposite him, as if the words themselves had summoned it. A high, wild whinny pierced the storm. It was close, terrifyingly close. a sound of pure, untamed spirit. Jude was at the window in an instant, wiping the condensation from the glass. In a flash of lightning that illuminated the canyon, he saw it. Ghost lantern. The white stallion was on the ledge not 50 yards away, its head up, scenting the wind, its mane a torrent of white. Tamsin was beside him, peering out. "My God, is it real? He's real!" Jude said. "He comes here, most nights. Why does he belong to you? No, he belongs to the canyon." Jude let the curtain fall, but he stayed at the window. He only trusts things that don't try to tame him. He stays close because he knows I'll never put a rope on him. He turned to look at her. The unspoken parallel hung in the air between them. "I will not put a rope on you." Tamsin broke the gaze first, moving back to the stove's warmth. "Pike doesn't just want silver, he wants wellspring for the water." Jude watched her. "Go on. Water is life in this land." "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice quiet but intense. "You can't run a stamp mill without it. You can't raise cattle. You can't bleed a valley dry and buy the farms for pennies unless you control its water first. He's not a miner. He's a parasite. The boss wants the water maps." The last piece clicked into place. His brother's murder and her arrival were not two stories. They were one. The knowledge breached a wall in him that had held for 5 years. He walked to the mantel. He didn't touch the scorched linen, but he stared at it. "That was Silas's," he said, his voice rough. "My brother—" Tamsin waited, still and silent, letting him speak in his own time. He told her. The words were hard, like rocks pulled from frozen ground. The fire, the ragged spurs, the smell of the smoke, finding what was left of Silas in the ashes. "I made a vow that night," he finished, his back still to her. "Over his grave, I won't ever tie another soul to me. I won't be the reason someone else has to look at a coffin. I won't be the reason for that pain." He expected her to recoil, to show pity, to be afraid of the darkness in him. He turned. Tamsin had not moved. Her eyes were not filled with pity, but with a deep, knowing sorrow that matched his own. She took a step closer, not into his space, but just enough to bridge the cold gap between them. "You are not the grave of your past." "Jude," she said, her voice soft, but firm as steel, "do not let Luther Pike be the one who turns you into it." The storm sealed them in. For 2 days, the cabin was an island in a howling white ocean. The wind was a physical pressure against the door, and the world was reduced to the smell of juniper smoke, the sound of the gale, and the presence of the other. They had made their pact. The cabin, which had been Jude's fortress of solitude, now held an ally. The silence between them changed. It was no longer the empty, jagged silence of his grief, but a shared, watchful quiet. On the second night, the fire was burning high. Jude was cleaning his tack, the scent of leather oil mixing with the stew Tamsin was simmering. She had been restless, pacing the small space, checking the windows, then staring into the fire. "In Santa Fe," she said, her voice quiet. "My mother used to say that a room isn't a cage if you can dance in it." Jude paused, his hand still on the bridle. "This ain't a parlor, and I don't have a fiddle. You don't need one." She turned from the fire, a small, challenging light in her eyes. "It's just walking. To a rhythm. Stand up, Mr. Callahan." He looked at her, at the small space between the table and the hearth. He felt large, clumsy, a creature of rock and iron. "I don't dance." "You know how to count to 3, don't you?" She moved into the open space. "Stand up. It's better than waiting for the wind to tear the roof off." He did not know why he obeyed. Perhaps it was the command in her voice, or the simple human need, after 2 days of siege, to do something that was not just about survival. He stood, towering over her. Now what his voice was a low rumble. "Give me your hand." He held out his right. "No, your left." She took it, her palm dry and firm. "Now, your other hand. Place it on my back, gently." He hesitated. This was not in the terms. This was a breach. But she was looking at him with such steady confidence that it felt like a new clause in their agreement. He slowly, carefully, placed his large, calloused hand on her back. He felt the thick weave of her wool shirt, And beneath it, the solid, living warmth of her. It was not a fragile thing. "Just rest it there," she said. "Don't grip. Now, just follow my feet. It's a simple waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, I'll hum." She began to hum a tune he'd never heard, something soft and old. She pushed off with her left foot. He followed, his heavy boots scuffing the plank floor. He was all angles and resistance, but she moved with a fluid grace, guiding him, turning him in the small space. 1, 2, 3. His hand on her back. 1, 2, 3. Her hand on his shoulder. The cabin was tiny. They could only take 2 steps before they had to turn. The firelight bathed them in amber, casting their merged shadow large against the wall. He smelled the clean scent of herbs on her hair and the smoke that clung to her clothes. Their breath began to fall into the same rhythm. He stopped thinking about his feet and started to feel the pull and push of her body, the quiet instruction of her hand, his hand, which knew only the harsh shock of the hammer and the pull of leather reins, learned the shape of her. He realized his hand was steady. It was not trembling. The humming stopped. They stood in the middle of the floor, the wind's howl rushing back in to fill the silence. They were still holding each other. They were breathing the same small pocket of warm air. He looked down at her face, lit by the fire. She looked up at him, her lips slightly parted, her eyes clear. He had not been this close to another person in 5 years. He bent his head, a slow, deliberate movement. It was not a lunge. It was a question. She did not pull away. She did not flinch. She rose slightly on her toes, meeting him halfway. The first touch of their lips was tentative. It was chapped skin and winter cold, brief and electric, a test of the ice. They pulled back, only an inch. Their eyes were still locked. He saw her breath catch. He moved again, and this time there was no hesitation. This kiss was firm. It was not the kiss of a lover, but of a survivor finding sudden, unexpected warmth. It was a kiss of shared solitude, of the storm outside and the fire within. It was long, and it was deep, and it was profoundly still. Her fingers tightened on his shoulder, and his hand, the one on her back, moved from resting to holding, pulling her closer, anchoring her to him, when they finally broke apart. The air in the cabin felt different. It was charged. The rules of their arrangement had not just been broken, they had been burned away. He looked at his cold bedroll on the floor, then at her narrow cot. His voice was rough. "The floor is cold, the cot is narrow," she whispered, her voice unsteady for the first time. Jude turned from her and took the heavy wool blanket from his own cot. He did not walk to her bed. He sat on the wide stone hearth, his back against the warm chimney, and opened the blanket. It was an invitation. Nothing more. Tamsin watched him for a moment. Then she crossed the small distance. She sat beside him, and he wrapped the thick wool around them both, creating a shared world. She settled against his side, her head finding the natural hollow of his shoulder. He rested his chin on the top of her head. It was an intimacy deeper than the kiss. It was a silent agreement of trust. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the storm. Then she began to talk, her voice a low murmur against his chest. She spoke of the arid hills of Santa Fe, of the smell of pinon smoke. She told him about a scar on her left hand, a thin white line from a runaway horse. He found himself speaking, too. His voice was thick, rusty with unused words. He told her about a scar on his own ribs, where a hot spur had laid him open during a branding. They whispered about dreams, not the nightmares that haunted them, but the small, forgotten ones. He dreamed of building a water wheel. She dreamed of planting an apple orchard. She shifted, turning in the cocoon of the blanket to face him, tucking her legs beside her. She pressed her forehead to his. He could feel the pulse in her temple. He raised his hands and held her face, his thumbs gently brushing her cheekbones. The kisses that followed were different from the first. They were slow and searching, a mapping of lips, a quiet reassurance. They were chaste, yet profoundly intimate, kisses that sought comfort rather than passion. Tamsin laid her hand flat on his chest, over his thick cotton shirt, beneath her palm. She felt his heart. It was not the frantic beat of a cornered animal, but a strong, steady rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of the forge hammer, but steady, alive. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed a sheet of ice against the window, the glass rattling as if it would break. Tamsin let out a small, quiet laugh, the sound muffled against his shirt. The sound of it, soft and real in the midst of the gale, cracked something hard in Jude's chest. He held her tighter. They were two people, no longer just watching the storm, but choosing to hold on to each other in the heart of it. They woke on the hearth, stiff and entangled in the blanket. Jude woke first, as he always did, before the light. He was warmer than he had been in 5 years. Tamsin was asleep, her face peaceful in the fire's dying embers, burrowed into his shoulder. He moved with agonizing slowness, extracting himself without waking her. He rebuilt the fire, his movements sure. He put the pot on for coffee. He pulled on his boots and coat and stepped out into the pre-dawn gray. The storm was weakening, the wind just a low moan. He went to the woodpile, his axe sinking deep with a satisfying thwack. He was not splitting wood to forget. He was splitting wood to keep the cabin warm. When he came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots, she was awake. The cabin smelled of his coffee, but also of something new. She had found a small tin of herbs in her bag and was brewing tea in a tin cup. The air was rich with sage and mint. She handed him a steaming mug. It was not his bitter coffee. It was her tea. He drank. It was hot, clean, and sweet. He looked at her over the rim of the cup, and she looked back. It was a new ritual. The cabin was no longer a hideout. That night, the storm was almost gone. Jude looked at his bedroll, then at her cot. She watched him. He said nothing, but picked up his bedding. She moved her cot away from the wall. He laid his bedroll beside it, pushing the two narrow beds together to form one. It was a small, shared space. They both nodded. The next day, the sun was a weak promise behind the clouds. Tamsin was humming her waltz tune as she wiped the grime from the inside of the window. Jude found himself standing before the mantelpiece, before the shrine. His brother's scorched handkerchief lay there. Beside it were the other artifacts of his grief, a rusted spur from the old barn, a single spent cartridge he'd found by the ashes, the dried-out tail of a scorpion, things of death. Tamsin stopped humming. She watched him. He did not touch the handkerchief, but one by one, he picked up the other items. The spur, the cartridge, the tail. He walked to the cabin door, opened it, and threw them as hard as he could into the deep snowdrift, where they vanished. He came back inside. The mantel was clear, save for the one sacred piece of linen. But now, there was space. Later that afternoon, Tamsin braved the outside, the wind now just a sharp breeze. She returned a few minutes later, her cheeks red with cold. In her gloved hand, she held a small, tough cluster of yellow wildflowers, fighters that had bloomed in a crack of the rock face. She found an empty bottle, filled it with water, and set the flowers on the mantel, next to the scorched handkerchief. She did not try to replace his past. She just added her life to it. The morning the storm finally broke, the world was blinding white, the sky a painful, brilliant blue, and the horse was there. Ghost Lantern was not on the far ridge. He was close. He stood on the flat rock by the barn, less than 100 yards away, watching the cabin. "He's never been that close," Jude said, his voice hushed. Tamsin pulled on her cloak and stepped onto the small porch, into the frozen air. Jude tensed, a warning on his lips. The horse was wild. It would bolt, but Tamsin did not walk toward it. She just stood, letting the stallion assess her. Then, she slowly, deliberately, held out her hand, palm up. She held no sugar, no rope, no bridle. She offered nothing but her own stillness. The stallion snorted, a great plume of steam erupting from its nostrils. It stamped a hoof on the snow-covered rock. It looked at her, then at Jude standing in the cabin doorway. The horse took one step closer, then another. It stretched its magnificent head forward, neck arched, and sniffed the air just yards from her extended fingers. It held the pose for a long, silent count, its dark eye fixed on her. Then, with a toss of its head, it turned, not in fear, but in decision. It trotted to the canyon edge, wheeled, and vanished down the trail. It was not a rejection. It was an acknowledgement. He had seen them, and he would be back. The road down to Silver Mesa was a treacherous ribbon of ice, but the sky was a clear, hard blue. Jude drove his own utility wagon. Tamsin's repaired wagon hitched behind. They sat side by side on the bench, not speaking. The small, warm intimacies of the storm-bound cabin had frozen, replaced by the cold air of their purpose. They went first to the territorial registrar's office, a cramped, dusty room smelling of stale paper and stove smoke. The clerk, a man named Eli Moffett, peered at them over his spectacles. "We're here to file a marriage certificate," Jude said. His voice was flat. "A simple statement of business." Eli Moffett fumbled for the ledger. "A marriage Jude well. Congratulations. Who's the—" He saw Tamsin, and his meager professional cheer evaporated. He knew her, or rather, he knew the rumors that had arrived before her wagon. "Tamsin Vale," she said, providing the name. Moffett's hands visibly shook. "Miss Vale, I cannot. You are already listed as Tamsin Pike. Property holdings, tax ledgers, all filed by Judge Pike himself. I have an annulment, certified by the court in Santa Fe," Tamsin said, sliding the crisp document onto the counter. Moffett looked at the paper as if it were a snake. He read it, then read it again. "This is Santa Fe. This is the Arizona territory. Judge Pike. He operates under territorial law. He is the law here. This paper, it is not recognized in his jurisdiction." "Then file the new certificate," Tamsin said, her voice dropping. "Cold and dangerous. Let him contest it. File it, Mr. Moffett. Or will you be noted as the man who refused a legal filing? Moffett, trapped between two fears, chose the one that was not currently in the room." With a sweaty palm, he blotted the ink and, with a scratching pen, entered Jude Callahan and Tamsin Vale into the county record. The string of the guitar had been plucked. The low, humming vibration had begun. They rode back to Canyon Mercy in silence. The air was thick with what was to come. That night, the pretense of their separate lives was gone. They sat at the small table, the lamp casting a small golden circle in the vast darkness. Tamsin unstrapped her large carpet bag, the one she had guarded so closely. From it, she removed a heavy leather-bound ledger, a sheaf of invoices, and a rolled map. She laid them out. "You kept your term, no lies about the big things," she began. She told him of her parents, of their ranch, Wellspring, the finest water source in the county. She told him of their sudden, suspicious deaths in a wagon crash. And she told him of Luther Pike, who had arrived as a friend of the family, an executor of their will, a man who offered protection. "He didn't offer comfort," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He offered legal advice. He showed me debts I never knew my father had. He showed me tax liens. He said I would lose everything. He said the only way to protect my land, my water, was to merge my holdings with his. By law, marriage." Jude said, "It was not a question. He wrapped the law around my throat like a noose." She whispered, "I was 20 years old. I was alone. I signed the papers. I was Mrs. Luther Pike for 6 months. I was his prisoner. He never came to my room. He did not want a wife. He wanted a deed." She explained how she had escaped, feigning illness to travel to Santa Fe, where she had family connections and a court that Pike did not control. She got the annulment, but Pike had already filed the deeds in Arizona, absorbing Wellspring into his own vast, growing empire. He ignores the annulment. She said, "Here, I am his wife. My property is his property. My claim is his claim." Jude looked at the second set of papers, the invoices. "What are these fakes?" Tamsin said, "This is his method. This is the ledger he keeps. He wants to build a silver mine, a stamp mill. It requires millions of gallons of water, more than Wellspring alone can provide. She unrolled the map. It was a beautiful, detailed drawing of the Silver Mesa Valley. Jude saw his own land, Canyon Mercy, marked on the high ridge. He saw the farms of his neighbors, and he saw the blue artery of the wellspring. But there was another line, a proposed line, drawn in red ink. A line that began at Wellspring and diverted the water, moving it west, straight toward a patch of land marked Pike Holdings. "He's going to dry them out," Jude breathed, his hand tracing the red line. It cut off every farm downstream. He'll divert the water, the valley turns to dust, and he'll buy their land for pennies on the dollar. "He already is," Tamsin said, pushing the ledger toward him. "Fake invoices for seed, loans against their crops at 40%. He is biding his time, waiting for the first drought, and then he will own this entire valley. Wellspring is the key." Jude stared at the map, his blood running cold, his eyes fixed on the margin, near his own property line. There was a small, handwritten note in the same elegant, precise script as the map's labels. It read, "Ragged spurs to check Callahan inventory for any old survey maps. Secure at all costs. Water first." Jude's breath stopped. He touched the ink. He had seen that handwriting before. On the foreclosure notice tacked to the general store door. On the public ordinance restricting grazing rights. It was Judge Luther Pike's handwriting. The room went utterly silent. The wind outside seemed to die. The night 5 years ago crashed into the present. The fire, the smoke, his brother's screams. The boss wants the water maps. It had not been a robbery gone wrong. It had not been random. It had been an execution, ordered by the judge, to secure a map. Silas had died protecting a piece of paper that would have exposed Pike's plan. Jude Tamsin's voice was small. She saw the change in his face, the color draining, the terrifying stillness that settled in his eyes. He stood up. He walked to the mantel and touched the scorched handkerchief. He did not speak. He just stood there, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. He was no longer a man helping a stranger. He was an instrument of vengeance. The news hit Prospect's Reach like a flash flood. Jude Callahan was married. It took 2 days for the clerk, Moffat, to whisper it to his wife, who whispered it to the butcher, who told Mrs. Tilda Crane, married Mrs. Crane bellowed in her store, causing a pyramid of canned peaches to tremble. Jude Callahan to that woman, the Pike woman. They came to the store 3 days after the filing, needing supplies. The store went silent. Every eye was on them. Mrs. Crane marched up to Jude, her hands on her hips. "Jude," she said, her voice loud enough for all to hear. "After all these years, after I offered you my own sweet Elspeth, you go and tie yourself to a runaway, a woman with baggage heavy enough to sink a steamship. Have you lost your senses?" Jude looked at her, his face a mask of stone. He said nothing. Tamsin stepped forward. She was not carrying her purse. She was carrying the ledger. She did not argue. She did not defend her name. She simply opened the heavy book on the counter, on top of a bolt of calico. "Mrs. Crane," Tamsin said, her voice clear and calm. "Do you know Jebediah Smith down in the hollow, of course? A good man. Weak lungs. He owes Judge Pike $200 for seed, at 30% interest. Due in April." She turned a page. "Do you know the widow Alvarez? The one with the 5 children I do?" "Mrs." Crane said, her voice softer, her eyes narrowing at the book. "Her well mortgage. Judge Pike bought it from the bank in Tucson. He's tripled her payments. She's 2 months from foreclosure." Tamsin turned page after page. She named name after name, men and women Mrs. Crane had known her entire life. Neighbors, customers, the poor, the struggling, the decent. It was a book of strangulation, all meticulously recorded in Pike's elegant hand. Mrs. Crane went pale. She looked up from the book, her eyes wide, no longer angry, but afraid. "That man," she whispered, staring at the ledger. "He's a serpent. He's poisoning the well for all of us." She looked at Tamsin, then at Jude, and her gaze was new. It was one of awe, and of fear. You are not married. You are going to war. She was not the only one. As they left, Father Merriweather stepped out of the small white church. He was a kind man, his face weathered by sun and worry. He blocked their path, his hat in his hands. Jude, Mrs. Callahan. He stumbled over the name. I must speak on this. I heard the news from Mr. Moffat. I was not asked to perform a ceremony. I was not asked for my blessing. He looked genuinely pained. Marriage is sacred. It is a holy vow before God. It is not. It is not a convenience or a tool. Tamsin stopped. She looked at the small wooden cross above his church door. Father, she said, her voice gentle, is water not sacred? The water God gave this valley, to feed the families you pray for, to baptize the children you welcome. He is stealing it. He is turning this valley to dust to fill his own pockets. She met the priest's troubled eyes. Sacred is clean water to keep a town alive. Sacred is stopping a man who would watch children starve. We are honoring that sacred trust. Will you, Father Merriweather, had no answer. He stepped aside and let them pass. The final confrontation came that evening. They were in the barn, Jude checking Tamsin's horses. The sun was a smear of blood orange on the western ridge when two riders appeared, coming up the canyon road. They were not neighbors. It was Rory Finch and another man, both wearing the high gun rig favored by Pike's hired hands. They stopped 20 yards from the barn, their horses nervous. Callahan Finch yelled. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. We hear you got some company. Jude emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He stood in the open, Tamsin just behind him in the shadow of the doorway. The judge heard his wife was in the territory. Finch called out, his voice a mocking sing-song. He's a forgiving man. He just wants to welcome Mrs. Pike home. She's not Mrs. Pike, Jude said. His voice was not loud, but it carried in the cold. Still air. Finch laughed. That ain't what the law says. Smithy, the judge wants his property. Send her out. Jude took 2 steps forward, planting himself between the riders and the barn door. He was a solid wall of muscle and resolve. Her name is Tamsin Vale. She is not his wife, and she is not property. He dropped the rag. Get off my land. Finch's smile vanished. He looked at Jude, then at the rifle leaning just inside the barn door, then back at Jude. He saw a man who was not just stubborn, but was welcoming a fight. The judge ain't gonna like this. Callahan, you just made a bad enemy. He's been my enemy for 5 years. Jude said, he just didn't know it. Finch held his gaze for a long 10 seconds, then yanked his reins. This ain't over. They wheeled their horses and galloped back down the canyon, kicking up sprays of ice. Tamsin stepped out of the shadow, her hand on the barn door, her knuckles white. She was breathing fast. Jude turned to her. The sun was gone. The cold was setting in. They'll be back, she said. Not like that. Jude said, he'll try the law first. He'll use his own court. We can't win there. He looked down toward Silver Mesa, the lights just beginning to shine. He thought of the faces in the ledger. He thought of his brother, the winter market. He said, what, the winter market? In 10 days. It's the biggest day of the year. Everyone in the county, every farmer, every rancher, they'll all be in the town square. Pike will be there. He gives a speech every year. Jude turned to her, his eyes dark, but alive with a cold, terrible fire. We can't fight him in his court. Tamsin. So we'll make the whole town our courtroom. The day of the shooting competition dawned clear and cold. Judge Luther Pike intended it as a show of force, a fundraiser for his Silver Mesa prosperity mine. He stood on a wooden platform draped in red, white, and blue bunting, his voice smooth and commanding as it rolled over the assembled townsfolk. He spoke of progress, of jobs, of a future bright as the silver he promised to pull from the earth. Rory Finch stood near the platform, his gun belt polished, a sneer fixed on his face. He was Pike's man, and today his job was to manage the competition and, if the opportunity arose, to arrange an accident for the town's newest problem, Jude Callahan. Jude and Tamsin arrived in their wagon and stood at the back of the crowd. His presence sent a ripple of murmurs through the town. He had signed up for the contest. The competition was simple 3 shots at a standard bullseye target, 50 yards distant. Several men shot. Their results mediocre. Finch shot, his 3 rounds clustering tightly in the center. He smiled, accepting the applause. Then, the clerk called, Jude Callahan. Jude moved through the crowd, which parted for him. He carried his rifle easily in one hand. When he reached the shooting line, he did not look at the target. He looked at Pike, his gaze flat and cold. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a heavy, newly forged horseshoe. He walked the 50 yards, took down the paper target, and replaced it with the horseshoe, hung by a piece of wire so it dangled freely. The crowd murmured. It was a smith's mark. It was a challenge. He walked back to the line. He raised his rifle. "Hold on there," Callahan Rory Finch shouted, walking up beside him, his own rifle in hand. "Rules say standard target. Rules say hit the target." Jude countered, his voice a low rumble. "He's right. Mr. Finch," Deputy Shaw called out from the side, a small smile on his face. "Let the man shoot." Finch seethed. He took a step back, positioning himself just to Jude's right. As Jude settled his rifle to his shoulder, Finch, in a move of practiced clumsiness, tripped over a rut in the dirt. He stumbled forward, his rifle discharging with a deafening crack. The bullet kicked up dirt just inches from Jude's left boot. The crowd gasped. Tamsin's heart stopped. Jude did not flinch. He did not even turn his head. The gust of wind that had picked up that morning blew dust into Finch's face, making his stumble seem almost plausible, but Jude knew. He slowly lowered his rifle and looked at Finch, who was brushing himself off, a look of false apology on his face. Jude said nothing. He turned back to his target. He raised the rifle, took a breath, and fired. The clang of the bullet hitting the horseshoe rang clear across the square, setting the iron spinning. A perfect shot. But he was not done. He did not reload for the horseshoe. He scanned the perimeter. Far behind the platform, on a fence post easily double the distance, a good 100 yards, sat a small, decorative gourd left over from the harvest festival. Jude chambered another round. He sighted. The crowd held its breath. Pike stopped smiling. Jude fired. For a second, nothing. Then the gourd exploded in a puff of dried seeds and orange rind. A roar went up from the crowd. It was an impossible shot. It was a shot of pure, undeniable mastery. Jude lowered his rifle, the barrel smoking, and walked away, ignoring Finch, ignoring Pike. His point made. While the square was distracted, Tamsin moved. She slipped away from the cheering crowd, her eyes on the registrar's office, as she'd hoped. It was empty. The clerk, Mr. Moffat, surely listening to Pike's speech. She entered the dusty room, the bell on the door tinkling softly. She went straight to the ledgers. She knew what she was looking for. Not the marriage book, but the property deeds. She found the folio for Wellspring, the ink dark, Pike's signature a confident flourish beneath her own. Forged 1. She pulled carbon paper and a thin sheet of onion skin from her pocket. This was not enough. She needed more. She found the ledger for Pike's private land acquisitions. She turned the page. And another. There it was. Jebediah Smith's farm, the widow Alvarez's homestead, dozens of others, all signed over with signatures that looked shaky, or too perfect. Signatures she knew, from her ledger, were attached to fraudulent debts. She began to trace them, her hand moving quickly, capturing the evidence of Pike's widespread forgery. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Tamsin froze. Rory Finch stood in the doorway, blocking the light. He must have left the contest immediately after Jude's shot. The judge doesn't like people reading his private mail. Finch sneered, his hand dropping to his gun. Tamsin acted. She grabbed the heaviest ledger on the desk, county tax records, 1885, and hurled it at his chest. Finch grunted as the heavy book hit him, a woof of air leaving his lungs. It bought Tamsin 2 seconds. She bolted out the back door, stuffing the carbon papers into her shirt. She was in the narrow wooden alley that ran between the office and the general store. She heard Finch curse and his boots hit the boardwalk behind her. She ran, her skirt tangling in her legs. The alley was a trap, ending in a high wooden fence. Finch was gaining. "You're fast, widow, but you're cornered." She looked around, desperate. A stack of rain barrels. She scrambled onto one, her fingers finding a grip on the low-hanging eaves of the assay office. She pulled herself up, her boots scraping the wood. She rolled onto the low, flat roof. She heard Finch grunt as he tried to follow. She got to her feet and ran. She crossed the assay office roof and leaped the small gap to the sloping tin roof of Mrs. Crane's general store. Her boots hit the tin and slipped. The metal screeched, a horrible, high-pitched sound that cut through the noise of the square. She was sliding, fast, toward the edge, a 10-foot drop to the hard-packed street below. Finch was on the roof behind her, laughing. Tamsin saw the bunting, the thick rope of flags strung from the store's facade to the hotel across the street. It was her only chance. She hit the edge, pushed off with her feet, and lunged. Her fingers caught the rope. Her momentum, violent and sudden, swung her out over the street. The rope groaned, the flags snapping. She heard a woman scream. She swung in a wide arc, and as she reached the bottom, she let go. She landed hard in the back of a freight wagon parked below, crashing into a pile of empty grain sacks. The air was knocked from her lungs, but nothing was broken. Jude had heard the screech. He turned from the crowd and saw it all, Tamsin sliding, Finch on the roof, pulling his pistol. Jude moved. He was a blur of focused energy, crossing the square, disappearing into the alley between the store and the hotel. Finch, seeing Tamsin land, jumped from the low roof, landing in a crouch. He ran toward the wagon, his gun raised. He rounded the corner of the alley at a full run and met a solid, immovable object. Jude didn't punch him. He didn't draw his own weapon. As Finch raised his pistol to strike, Jude stepped into the man's lunge, seized his arm and the front of his shirt, and pivoted. It was a move of pure leverage, a smith turning heavy iron. Finch's own momentum carried him, and Jude threw him clean over his shoulder. Finch hit the ground flat on his back. The sound was a heavy, final thud. His gun skittered across the dirt. He lay there, gasping, the world spinning. Before Finch could recover his breath, Jude was on him, but not with a boot. He pulled a piggin string from his belt and, with a few quick, efficient movements, had Finch's hands and feet tied. "Jude, what is this?" Deputy Shaw ran up, his own pistol drawn, his face red from running. "He was chasing my wife, Deputy," Jude said, his voice level, though his chest was heaving. He drew on her. Tamsin climbed out of the wagon, bruised but steady, holding the precious carbon copies. "He found me in the registrar's office. Deputy, he was trying to stop me from taking these." She held out the papers. Shaw looked at the bound Finch, at Tamsin's disheveled state, at the papers, and finally at Jude. Shaw, a man who had long distrusted the judge but lacked the power to act, saw his opening. "Rory Finch," Shaw said, holstering his pistol. "I'm arresting you for assault, and for interfering with the county investigation." He hauled Finch to his feet. A cold, smooth voice cut through the commotion. A theatrical display. "Mr. Callahan." Judge Luther Pike stood there, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked at the bound Finch with disappointment, then at Tamsin. "My dear," he said, his smile thin and cold. "I see you found some paperwork. I have your forgeries." "Judge," Tamsin said, her voice shaking but strong. Pike chuckled, a dry sound. "You have paper, my dear. You have a blacksmith. You have one confused deputy holding my hired man." He gestured to the imposing brick courthouse behind him. "I have a judge's bench. I have the law, and as you can see—" He nodded to the other armed men in the crowd who were watching, their hands on their belts. "I have the guns. Your paper will burn." He turned and walked away. The ride home to Canyon Mercy was quiet. The small victory felt like a trap being set. The sky, which had been so clear, turned a bruised purple, and a cold, driving sleet began to fall. The temperature dropped, and the rain turned to needles of ice. Tamsin, wearing only her wool cloak, began to shiver violently. Jude said nothing. He pulled the wagon to a brief stop. He shrugged off his heavy leather stockman's coat, the one lined with thick sheepskin, and wrapped it around her. He pulled the collar up high and settled the heavy coat over her lap, cocooning her in its warmth. He, in his shirt sleeves, seemed immune to the ice. His focus on the road. They rode on, the sleet hissing against the wagon. In the cold darkness, under the shelter of the coat, Tamsin felt for his hand. She found it, calloused, strong, and cold from the rains. She slid her fingers between his and held on tight. Jude's hand closed around hers, a silent, powerful promise. As they neared the canyon, a shape moved on the ridge. Ghost Lantern. The white stallion emerged from the freezing mist, its coat almost glowing. It fell into pace with the wagon, its head high, flanking them. It did not leave. It escorted them through the icy darkness, a silent guardian, all the way back to the safety of the barn. The sleet had stopped by the time they reached the barn, but the world was frozen, brittle and sharp. Ghost Lantern, having seen them safely to the door, gave a low, quiet nicker and vanished into the rocky shadows. His duty done. Inside the cabin, Jude moved with a silent, contained fury. He built the fire up until it roared in the stove, a blazing heart against the ice. Tamsin, still wrapped in his coat, sat on the hearth, her hands extended to the warmth, though she could not stop trembling. The confrontation with Pike had stripped away the last layer of their pretense. She watched him. He was checking his rifle, his movements clean and economical. His jaw set so hard a muscle jumped. He was a man preparing for a war he had just realized he was already losing. He told me, Tamsin said, her voice small, that I would lose everything, that my father's debts were overwhelming. Jude paused, the rifle stock resting on the floor. He did not look at her, but he was listening. It was just after the funeral. My parents were in the ground 2 days. He came to the ranch house, not with a casserole, but with a stack of ledgers. Her voice was quiet, reciting a story worn smooth with bitter memory. He showed me papers, liens from banks I'd never heard of, grain bills, tax assessments. He said the county would seize Wellspring by the end of the month. She pulled her knees to her chest. He offered me a solution, a legal partnership. He said if we joined our holdings, his assets would cover my debts, and the land would be safe. He said it was the only way to save my home. The law around your neck, Jude murmured, remembering her words. A noose, she agreed, her voice trembling. I was 20 years old. I was terrified. He was a judge. He was my father's friend. I trusted him. She let out a breath that was half a sob. The marriage ceremony was in his private study, just his clerk as a witness, and the moment I signed my name, Tamsin Pike, it was done. I had given him my land. I had given him my water. I was a prisoner in my own house. He never wanted a wife. Jude, he wanted a deed. He wanted my signature. Jude finally turned to look at her. The anger in his face was gone, replaced by a deep, aching understanding. He crossed the room and sat on the floor, not on the hearth with her, but near, respecting the boundary of her pain. After, he said, his own voice rough, after Silas, I was going to leave. Her head snapped up. Leave Canyon Mercy. He nodded, staring at the scarred floorboards between his boots. I packed a bag. I had my horse saddled. I was going to sell the land, or just let the bank take it. I didn't care. I was going to ride south and not stop until the red dust was out of my lungs. What stopped you? She whispered. I rode to the canyon edge. I was saying goodbye to the grave, and I heard it. A sound, the clang of a hammer on an anvil. But you were at the ridge. It was in my head. Silas. He loved the forge. He was the smith. I was just the cowhand. I kept hearing it. Clang, clang. And then I looked down. where the barn had burned. The ash was still thick. He swallowed, the memory hard. But there was green, a single blade of grass, pushing up through the black. It was spring. He looked at her, his eyes raw. I couldn't leave. The land, it wouldn't let me go, so I unpacked. I stayed, and I rebuilt the forge. I thought if I hammered long enough, I could hammer the memories out, make myself as hard as the steel. But all I did was trap myself here with his ghost. Tamsin moved from the hearth, closing the small space between them. She sat on the floor, facing him. You didn't just trap yourself. Jude, you kept the land safe. You held it. He shook his head, looking away. I just hid. No. She waited until he met her eyes. You waited for the right fight. He looked at her, at the strength in her face, the shared understanding of their separate, terrible survivals. He thought of the letter, the one that had sat in his father's tin box for nearly 5 years. Jed, the old mail rider, had brought it a full 3 months after the fire. Found this in the bottom of a misplaced bag. Jude. From before. My apologies. Jude had taken it, recognized Silas's strong, clear script, and had put it in the box, unread. He could not bear to open it. He could not read his brother's living words, not when the world was so dead. Now, he stood. He went to the small shelf, took down the tin box, and brought it back. He opened it. There, on top of his own deed to Canyon Mercy, was the letter. His hands, so steady with the hammer and the rifle, were not steady now. His thumb trembled as he broke the wax seal. He unfolded the single page. Tamsin moved closer, sitting beside him, her shoulder just brushing his arm, sharing the light from the lamp. He read the words aloud, his voice thick. Jude. It began. Heading to Tucson for the seed order. Should be back by Thursday. I was looking over those old survey maps our father kept. You know, the ones showing the water tables. It's just as we thought. That wellspring is the heart of this valley. It's not just a spring. It's the mouth of a river. If a man controlled that, he'd control everything from here to the border. Jude paused, his throat tight. He read on. You keep an eye on things. There's talk in town. A new judge, Pike, seems a little too interested in land that ain't for sale. Probably nothing, but you know me. I trust a rattlesnake in my boot more than a man in a new suit. Jude took a ragged breath. He came to the last lines. Mind the forge while I'm gone. And Jude, don't let this land make you as hard as the rock. Keep the water for the good folks. And don't keep the hate for yourself. It'll poison you faster than bad whiskey. See you Thursday. Silas. A single tear tracked through the grime on Jude's cheek. He didn't wipe it. The letter wasn't a curse. It wasn't a chain holding him to the past. It was a map. It was permission. It was his brother's blessing. Tamsin said nothing. She simply reached out and placed her palm flat on his cheek, her thumb gently brushing away the tear. It was a gesture of profound, simple comfort. Jude leaned into her hand, closing his eyes for a brief second. The warmth of her skin a sudden anchor. He turned his head, his lips pressing into the center of her palm. He breathed her in. Sage, smoke, life. When he opened his eyes, she was there. All the walls were gone. He put the letter down and gathered her in his arms, pulling her from the floor and onto his lap as he sat on the hearth. She came without resistance, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body fitting against his as if she were made for it. He held her face between his rough hands, and he kissed her. It was not the tentative kiss of the dance, nor the comforting kisses of the storm. This was a kiss of raw, desperate gratitude. It was a kiss that said, "You are here, you are real. I am not alone." He poured all the grief, all the loneliness, all the years of silence into it. She met him with equal force, her fingers tangled in his hair, holding him to her. She kissed him back, a kiss of acceptance, of shared burdens, of a future she was demanding they have. It was a long, slow, deepening embrace that left them both breathless. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, their breath mingling in the cold air. He could feel her heart pounding against his ribs. Or perhaps it was his own. He no longer knew where he ended and she began. He felt her shoulders tremble. Not from cold, but from the release of her own held-back terror. He held her tighter, his arms a steel band around her, his face buried in the hollow of her neck. He breathed in the scent of her skin. He was holding onto the first living, hopeful thing that had come into his canyon in 5 years. "If we get through this," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "If we stop him. If we make it through this winter." He pulled back just enough to see her eyes, dark and shining in the firelight. "I want to stay for the summer," she said, her voice shaking but fierce. "And the fall, and every season after that. Jude Callahan. I don't just want a winter." It was the most dangerous, beautiful thing he had ever heard. The vow he had made to never tie another soul to him crumbled to dust. It had been a promise made of fear. This was a promise made of courage. "I want that too," he said, his voice thick. "All of them." It was the first true promise he had made since the fire. The next morning, the ground was hard, the ice like glass. Jude was outside by the barn, where a small, wild juniper sapling had been half torn from the ground by the ice storm, its roots exposed. He looked at it, a survivor, like them. He took his shovel. He didn't dig a grave, he dug a hole, right by his own small cabin well. In the protected lee of the chimney, he dug into the hard, unforgiving earth. Tamsin came out. Pulling his leather coat, it was hers now. He supposed, around her. "What are you doing, planting?" he said. He gently lifted the small, wounded tree. Tamsin knelt beside him. Together, they firmed the cold, dark earth around its roots. Their bare hands working side by side, they packed the soil, tamping it down, giving it a new home. When they were done, they stood and looked at the small, brave tree. "It needs a name," Tamsin said. Jude looked at the tree, then at her. "Sapling Hope." She smiled, a true, bright smile that lit her face. Sapling Hope. They stood there for a moment, a man and a woman by a tiny tree, the vast, cold canyon their witness. That night, the peace held. They sat before the fire, the tension of the day gone, replaced by a quiet, shared resolve. Tamsin was reading from Silas's letter again, her voice soft. Jude got up to look out the window. "A nightly ritual. Checking the ridgelines?" He went still. "Tamsin," he said, his voice low, pulling her from the letter. She was at his side in an instant. "What is it?" he pointed. "Not toward town, not toward the canyon road." He pointed to the high, dark ridges to the east, the wilderness trails. "Fires," he said. She squinted. At first, she saw nothing. Then she saw them. Not one, but 3, 4, no, 5 pinpricks of light, blazing where no lights should be. Travelers, she asked, though she knew the answer. "That's the high trail." "The one they used to move stolen herds," Jude said, his voice flat and cold. "That's where they hide. That's their territory. Who the ragged spurs?" He said, "Pike isn't just threatening us with paper anymore. He's called his dogs." The Prospects Reach Winter Market was the heart of the season. It was the one day the entire county came together, a sprawling, noisy celebration of survival. The air in the town square was thick with the smell of roasting chestnuts, pine needles, and mulled cider. Farmers displayed their last hardy crops. Ranchers traded horses, and children wove through the legs of the crowd, their laughter sharp in the cold. Above it all, on the steps of the courthouse, Judge Luther Pike was preparing his annual address, a picture of civic authority in his fine wool coat, his voice already warming up as he greeted the town's prominent merchants. Into this scene of forced cheer, Jude and Tamsin arrived. They did not come to trade. They came, as Jude had said, to hold court. They didn't set up a stall. They walked to the center of the square, by the frozen town fountain. And Tamsin began to unroll the map of the valley across 2 large shipping crates. Jude stood beside her, his rifle held loosely in his hand, his duster pushed back. He was not a shopper. He was a sentinel. A crowd, drawn by the strange display, began to gather. "What's this?" Then a farmer asked, stamping his feet against the cold. Tamsin placed a rock on the corner of the map. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it carried, "This, gentlemen, is your valley. And this, she pointed to the red line, is Judge Pike's plan to kill it. She unrolled the carbon copies of the forged deeds. She opened the ledger. She began to speak. She named Jebediah Smith and his fraudulent seed bill. She named the widow Alvarez and her stolen mortgage. She spoke of the 40% interest rates, the faked liens, the systematic campaign to bleed the small farmers dry. And then she pointed to the red line on the map. He plans to divert the wellspring. He will turn every farm downstream of it to dust. Your farms, your homes. And when you are broke and starving, he will buy your land for pennies. He is not building a mine. He is digging your graves. The laughter in the square died. The murmuring grew, angry and afraid. Mrs. Crane and Father Merriweather stood at the edges of the crowd, watching, waiting. Judge Pike stopped his speech. He walked down from the courthouse steps, a look of paternalistic concern on his face. His hired men, scattered through the crowd, began to move inward. "What is this?" Pike said, his voice booming, full of false sadness. "Mrs. Pike, my dear, confused wife," he addressed the crowd, his tone sorrowful. "My wife, Tamsin, has been unwell. She suffers from delusions. She has stolen some of my private business papers and is misinterpreting them." He smiled, a sad, tolerant smile. "She does not understand the complexities of finance." A few men in the crowd nodded. This, they understood. A difficult woman. "I am not your wife." "Luther," Tamsin said, her voice ringing. "My dear, the law says otherwise." Pike said smoothly, "Territorial law is quite clear on a husband's rights. These papers," he gestured to the crates, "are my property. She is my wife. I thank you all for your patience. I will take her home now, where she can rest." He was winning. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable. This was a domestic dispute, and the judge held all the legal cards. "My marriage to you was annulled in Santa Fe," Judge Tamsin declared. Pike scoffed. "A piece of paper from another territory. It means nothing here. Here, I am the law, and you are my wife. That is not true." "Judge Pike." The voice was new. It was female, sharp, and confident. A woman stepped from the crowd, dressed in a smart traveling suit. She was a stranger. "My name is Alma Ruiz," the woman said. "I am the chief clerk for the Santa Fe District Court. I have traveled here to certify that this annulment," she held up a document with a heavy wax seal, "is legal, binding, and filed in accordance with federal, not just territorial, law. Mrs. Pike does not exist. This is Tamsin Vale, and her property is her own." The crowd gasped. A federal claim. This was bigger than Pike. Before Pike could respond, Deputy Shaw pushed through the crowd. His face was pale, but his eyes were hard. He was holding a piece of paper. Judge Pike Shaw called out, his voice shaking but loud. "I've been questioning Rory Finch. He has made a full confession." The square went utterly silent. "A confession to what?" Deputy Pike asked, his voice lethally calm. "He confessed that he and the Ragged Spurs were hired to attack Canyon Mercy 5 years ago. He confessed they were under orders to find water survey maps, and to kill Silas Callahan if he resisted." The words hung in the frozen air. "Kill Silas Callahan. And who hired them?" Deputy Tamsin asked, her voice like the crack of a whip. Shaw looked at his boots, then raised his head, his eyes finding the judge. "He confessed they were hired by a man in a judge's robes." A collective moan of horror went up from the crowd. It was no longer a property dispute. It was murder. Pike's face transformed. The mask of civility shattered, revealing the feral animal beneath. He looked at his men, his eyes slits. He gave a single, sharp nod. 2 of his gunmen, standing near the general store, drew their pistols. They did not aim at Jude. They fired into the air. Crack, crack. The crowd screamed. Panic erupted. People shoved, trampling stalls, trying to flee. It was the chaos Pike needed to escape. But Jude was ready. He was not looking at the gunmen. He was looking at the church. He raised his rifle in one fluid, impossibly fast motion. He fired. The sound was not a gunshot. It was a clang, a deafening, resonant, bone-jarring bell. He had shot the great iron church bell in the steeple. 50 yards up, the sound exploded over the square, a commanding, terrifying alarm that drowned the pistols and the screams. The crowd froze, stunned by the sound, and the town reacted. Mrs. Crane, seeing the 2 gunmen by her store fumbling to reload, grabbed the heavy iron security grate. "Henry!" Now she screamed. She and her husband pulled, and the grate slammed down with a screech of metal, trapping the 2 gunmen inside the store's arcade. Father Merriweather, seeing the panic, threw open the heavy oak doors of the church. "Sanctuary, women and children, in here quickly." The square cleared in seconds, leaving a wide, empty space. It was just Jude, Tamsin, and Deputy Shaw on one side, and Pike and his remaining 3 gunmen on the other. A standoff. "It is over," Luther Tamsin shouted, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet. She held up the leather satchel that had held her papers. All that proof, all that work. She turned and, with a scream of frustration, hurled the satchel into a blazing chestnut vendor's brazier. The leather smoked and caught, the flames licking up. Pike stared, his mouth open, and then he began to laugh. A deep, relieved, ugly laugh. "You little fool, you destroyed it. It's all gone. It's your word against mine. And I am the judge, Tamsin, let him laugh." She waited. Then she smiled. A cold, sharp smile that cut him to the bone. That was a decoy. "Luther, full of old receipts." She tapped her chest. "My carbon copies are right here, and the originals, the ledger, the real map. They are in a bank vault in Santa Fe. I sent them with Alma Ruiz 2 days ago. All you have is ashes. But the whole county has your confession." The color drained from Pike's face. He had lost. He was ruined, and he knew it. He moved, not with logic, but with pure, desperate rage. He lunged, not at Jude, but at Tamsin, the closer, softer target. He was faster than anyone expected. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her back, and pressed a small, silver derringer to her temple. "No one moves," he screamed, his voice a raw shriek. "Shaw, drop your gun, blacksmith. Drop yours or she dies right here." Jude's rifle was up, sighted on Pike's heart, but he couldn't take the shot, not with Tamsin's head in the way. "Let her go. Pike," Jude said, his voice a low, deadly growl. "The rifle on the ground. Kick it away." "Now," Pike screamed, shoving the pistol hard against Tamsin's skin. Jude's face was a mask of agony. He looked at Tamsin, her eyes wide with terror, but she gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. "Do it, slowly." Jude lowered the rifle. He placed it on the ground. He kicked it away. It skittered across the packed dirt. He raised his empty hands. "She's out of this. It's me you want. Let her go, and I'm yours." "You think I'm a fool?" Pike hissed. He started to back away, dragging Tamsin with him toward the alley, toward his horse. Jude took a step forward. "There's no escape. Pike, the whole town saw. You're a murderer. I'll be a murderer in Mexico." But she dies first, then shoot me instead," Jude said, taking another step, his hand still raised. "She's just paper. I'm the one who knows the canyon. I'm the one who shot the bell. I'm the threat. Let her go, and shoot me." He took another step. He was 20 feet away. "Shoot me, Pike." Jude's voice was calm, a cold invitation. "Bungling your shot at me is how you lost Finch. Do it right this time. But if you do, every soul in this county, from here to the territorial line, will know you are a coward who fears the truth." Pike was shaking, his eyes wild. He was trapped between the man walking toward him and the hostage in his arm. He was losing his grip in that unbearable, stretched-tight second of silence. A sound ripped through the square. It was not a gunshot. It was a high, terrified, ringing whinny. From the mouth of the canyon road, Ghost Lantern appeared, drawn by the bell, or the shots, or some wild instinct. The white stallion reared, a vision of pure, panicked power, its eyes wide at the sea of people and the smell of smoke. Pike, his nerves shattered, flinched, his head jerked toward the impossible sound. It was all the time Tamsin needed. She dropped her weight, a dead fall, and simultaneously bit down on the hand that held her hair. Pike roared in pain, his grip loosening. Jude did not wait. He was not a gunman. He was a blacksmith. He crossed the 20 feet in 3 bounds. He did not go for Pike's gun. He went for the man. He hit Pike's chest with his shoulder, a blow like a forge hammer, a strike meant to move a ton of stubborn iron. Pike was thrown backward. The Derringer fired. The crack was deafening. The bullet tore past Jude's head, ripping his hat clean off his head and sending it spinning. Pike scrambled, trying to aim again, but Deputy Shaw was on him. Shaw's boot came down on Pike's wrist, and the Derringer clattered on the stones. Shaw jammed his own pistol into the judge's spine. "Luther Pike," Shaw bellowed, hauling the man to his feet, "you are under arrest for the murder of Silas Callahan, for conspiracy, for fraud, and for the attempted murder of Jude and Tamsin Callahan." Jude didn't hear the charges. He had Tamsin, pulling her up from the ground, crushing her to his chest, his hands shaking as he buried his face in her hair. He was breathing in her scent, assuring himself she was real, his heart hammering against hers, a frantic, desperate, and victorious rhythm. The ride back to Canyon Mercy was a silent one. The adrenaline of the confrontation had drained away, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and the raw, stinging scrape of bruises. Pike was in the town jail, his remaining men disarmed. Alma Ruiz was preparing her testimony for the territorial marshal, and the town of Prospect's Reach was in a state of stunned, buzzing shock. When they reached the cabin, the world was utterly still. The ice storm had passed, and the air had turned unseasonably mild. A great thaw had begun. Jude unhitched the team, his movements slow and automatic. Tamsin stood by the cabin door, leaning against the frame, simply watching him. The man who had been a ghost in his own home was now solid, real, his shadow dark against the melting snow. He walked past her into the cabin. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, red-gold embers. The room was quiet, peaceful. The only sound was the steady drip, drip, drip of water melting from the eaves, a sound like the first promise of spring rain. The air smelled of wood smoke and the damp, clean scent of pine. Jude set his rifle on its pegs. He turned. Tamsin was still by the door, still wrapped in his heavy coat, her face pale in the twilight. They looked at each other across the small room, the silence stretching, full of everything that had been said and done. He didn't speak. He just held out his hand. She walked to him, her boots silent on the plank floor. She did not just take his hand. She stepped into his embrace, her hands sliding inside his duster, wrapping around his waist. She pressed her face against his chest, and for the first time, she let herself shake. It was not from cold. It was the body's final release of a terror held back for months, for years. Jude's arms closed around her, a solid, unbreakable circle. He held her as she trembled, his own hands unsteady as he stroked her hair. He buried his face in the clean scent of it, his eyes shut tight. He was holding onto his life, his future, a thing he had nearly lost twice in one day. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice a rough vibration against her temple. "It's over. Tamsin, you're safe." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes dark and luminous, swimming with unshed tears. He did not kiss her. Not yet. He just looked at her, memorizing the face that had become his entire world. He raised one hand, his calloused thumb brushing the tear track on her cheek. "You're safe," he said again. A vow. She lifted her hand and covered his, pressing his palm to her skin. Then, slowly, with a reverence that made his heart ache, she lifted his hand to her lips and kissed the scarred, forge-rough knuckles. That simple, reverent gesture broke him. He bent his head and his lips found hers. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss of their first true night. It was a kiss of arrival. It was slow and deep and certain. It held no questions, only answers. It was a kiss of profound relief, of gratitude, of a love that had been tested in fire and had not burned. It was the sealing of a promise made in the town square, a promise that had no words. They moved to the hearth, sinking down onto the bedrolls that were now permanently joined. They sat facing each other, their knees touching, still holding on, The dying embers cast a warm, red glow on their faces. Tamsin took his hands again, both of them. She studied them, the map of his life, the thick calluses from the hammer, the white, thin scar on his wrist from a slipped chisel. She traced it with her fingertip, her touch gentle, inquisitive. "Does it hurt?" she whispered. "Not anymore," he said, his voice thick. He captured her hand and brought it to his own lips, kissing her palm, just as he had done with Silas's letter. But this was not for a ghost. It was for her. He pulled her closer, and she came willingly, settling against his chest. He did not kiss her again. He just held her. He rested his chin on the top of her head for a moment, then shifted, pressing his forehead to the warm, soft hollow of her neck. He breathed in. He could feel her pulse, the steady, living beat of her heart against his cheek. He let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 5 years. They stayed like that, in the quiet, simply breathing. The sound of the melting ice was the only clock. "What will you do with it?" Jude murmured against her skin. "Wellspring." She was quiet for a long time. He felt her take a deep breath. "I was thinking about that. In the wagon," she said, her voice soft. "Pike wanted to hoard it. I want to share it." He lifted his head to look at her. "I want to establish a territorial water trust," she said, her eyes clear and focused. "We'll build a new channel, an aqueduct, but it won't go to a mine. It will go to the farms. We'll portion it out, fairly, enough for crops, enough for life." She smiled, a small, fierce smile. "And the fees we charge, the profits, they'll go into a fund, the Mesa Women's Trust, for women like the widow Alvarez, for any woman who finds herself alone, with a man like Pike trying to wrap the law around her neck. It will be a fund for lawyers, and for deeds, and for futures." Jude watched her, his heart swelling so tight in his chest he could barely breathe. She was not just a survivor. She was a builder, a protector. He smiled, a slow, real smile that reached his eyes. "You're not just going to save this valley, you're going to raise it." He touched her cheek. "You are the wellspring of this town. Tamsin." She leaned into his hand, her eyes closing. "We are, Jude, we are." He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He went to the small tin box that held his most important papers. He took out the deed to Canyon Mercy. He laid it on the table. Then he took a blank piece of paper and a pen. "This agreement," he said, "was for protection. It was a shield for a winter. I am done hiding behind it, and I am done with you hiding, too." He began to write, his hands sure and strong. "This is a new contract, not of marriage, of partnership. When the court releases Wellspring back to you, its deed will be joined with this one, Canyon Mercy. Wellspring, one holding." He pushed the paper toward her and tapped the bottom line. "Co-owners, 50% to you, 50% to me. We are not a guardian and a widow. We are partners, in the land, in the water, and in the fight." Tamsin read the simple, handwritten lines. Her eyes blurred. It was not a noose. It was an anchor. It was a home. She picked up the pen, her hand steady, and signed her name. Tamsin Vale. Jude signed his name beside hers, Jude Callahan. The next morning, the sun was a brilliant, warm flood. The snow was in full retreat, and the sound of running water was everywhere. There was a knock on the door. It was Father Merriweather. He stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, his face humbled. I came to see if you were well," he said. He held out a small, fragrant bunch of dried lavender. "My housekeeper, she said this is for peace in the home." "Thank you, Father," Tamsin said, taking it, her voice gentle. "I owe you both an apology," the priest said, looking at Jude. "I quoted the law, but I forgot the gospel. You two, you have saved this community. You are a testament to what is truly sacred." He reached into his coat. He was not holding a Bible. He was holding a fresh, clean, official document. "After the incident, I spoke with Alma Ruiz. Your annulment is filed and recognized by the territory. You are, in the eyes of the law and God, a free woman." He laid the paper on their table. right next to their handwritten partnership. It was a blank marriage license, signed by the territorial clerk. The town. "We would be honored," Father Merriweather said, his voice thick with emotion, "if you ever chose to make it proper. No pretense, no winter bargain, just the real thing." He nodded, placed his hat on his head, and walked away. Jude and Tamsin looked at the license. Then Jude looked at her, his eyes clear. All the ghosts of the fire finally lay to rest. "I choose you, Tamsin," he said, his voice quiet, but it filled the room. "Not just for the winter," she smiled, her whole heart in her eyes. "And I choose you, for every season." Later that day, Jude went to the corral. Ghost Lantern was there. The white stallion had not returned to the high ridges. He was standing by the fence, watching the cabin. Jude didn't bring a bridle. He didn't bring a saddle. He brought only a single, thin rope, a light hackamore. He walked into the corral. The horse stood, its magnificent head high, and watched him. Jude did not move to tame him. He just held out the rope. An offer. The horse, the symbol of untamable freedom, lowered its head and allowed Jude to slip the rope over its muzzle. It was an act of trust. Jude led the stallion out. He cupped his hands, and Tamsin stepped into them. He lifted her onto the horse's bare back. He swung up behind her, his arms secure around her waist, his hands holding the rope lightly. They rode. They walked the stallion up the canyon road, past Sapling Hope, up to the high ridge. The sun was warm, and the air was full of the sound of the great thaw. Silver Mesa was spread out below them, a valley of promise. From the ridge, they could hear the distant, happy gurgle of the wellspring, free and running fast. It was the music of their new beginning. Spring came to Silver Mesa not as a gentle thaw, but as a flood of justice and new life. The territorial court, with Alma Ruiz presenting Tamsin's meticulous evidence from Santa Fe, moved with a speed that astonished the county. Luther Pike's reign of terror, built on paper and fear, collapsed in 3 days. He was stripped of his title. The ledgers, the forged deeds, and the testimonies of a dozen farmers he had blackmailed sealed his fate. He was found guilty of bribery, conspiracy, and fraud. But it was Deputy Shaw's final witness who ensured Pike would never see the valley again. Rory Finch, his face bruised and his arrogance broken, took the stand. In a low, flat voice, Finch detailed the meeting, the money, the order from Judge Pike to secure the water maps, no matter the cost, and the ambush at Canyon Mercy that had left Silas Callahan dead. Pike was sentenced to life in the territorial prison. The valley, in one collective breath, was free. The court immediately restored the deed to Wellspring to Tamsin Vale and nullified every fraudulent debt in Pike's ledger. The ragged spurs, their leader and paymaster gone, dissolved like mist. But Tamsin and Jude offered a choice. Several of the younger men, who had followed orders out of desperation rather than malice, were given a chance. They were offered fair wages, $2 a day, to work on the new canal project, digging the channels that would bring Wellspring's water to the farms Pike had tried to destroy. They traded their guns for shovels. Finch, for his testimony, received a reduced sentence of 5 years for his role in the raid. It was a Western redemption, a chance to build the land they had once terrorized. At Canyon Mercy, change was hammered into the land itself. Jude, with the help of the new canal crew, built a community water tower, fed by a channel from his own well. And in town, the day the new church bell was hung replacing the one Jude had cracked, he was there. With his own tools, he engraved the name Silas Callahan into the bronze. Now, when the bell rang, it was not just an alarm. It was a memory, a sound of a sacrifice that had saved them all. Tamsin became a force as powerful as the water she now controlled. The Mesa Women's Trust was established in the old registrar's office. She taught the widow Alvarez and 5 other women how to keep ledgers, how to read a contract, and how to negotiate a loan. She taught them to sign their own names, not as Mrs. Jebediah or under the guardianship of, but as themselves. She was giving them the one thing Pike had tried to steal from her power. Jude's forge grew. He tore down the small, three-sided shed of his grief and built a proper smithy, its doors wide open to the valley. He took on 2 apprentices, orphans from the church, and taught them how to shoe a horse, how to weld a broken pump arm, how to mend a plow. The clang, thud, hiss of his hammer was no longer a rhythm to keep the nightmares at bay. It was the sound of Silver Mesa rebuilding. It was the sound of life. Their wedding was not a winter bargain. It was a spring promise. They stood not in the church, but on the banks of the wellspring itself, the water gurgling happily at their feet. The entire town was there. Tamsin wore a simple blue dress, but over it, she wore Jude's leather stockman's coat, the one that had sheltered her in the ice storm. In her hair, she wore a simple wreath of wild sage. Jude wore his work clothes, clean and pressed, his face scrubbed, his eyes clear. Father Merriweather performed the service, using the license he had given them. The vows were not from a book. They were the ones they had written on their partnership deed. "I choose you," Jude said, his voice rough and steady, his hands holding hers. Not to have or to hold, not to possess, just to choose, every day. Tamsin's voice was clear as the water beside them. "And I choose you, not to obey or to follow, but to stand beside, every day." When he kissed her, the valley erupted in cheers. That night, there was no grand party. There was only the cabin, their cabin. Jude had strung a line of small oil lanterns along the porch roof, and their light cast a soft, golden glow. He set a phonograph, a gift from Mrs. Crane, on a barrel, and a scratchy, tinny waltz filled the night air. He held out his hand. "May I, Mrs. Callahan?" She smiled, the name sounding new and right. "You may, Mr. Callahan." They danced on the narrow wooden porch, under the stars, surrounded by the vast, quiet canyon. It was not the clumsy, counting to 3 steps of their first night. This was a dance of partners, fluid and easy, their bodies knowing the rhythm of the other. He held her close, his arms secure around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder. The music played on, but they slowed until they were just swaying, holding each other in the lantern light. He lifted her chin, and his kiss was long and slow, and full of the promise of a lifetime. It was a kiss of deep, quiet passion, a kiss that had waited through a winter of violence and a spring of hard work. Her fingers laced behind his neck. His hands held her, anchoring her to him. There was no rush. There was only the warm spring night and the shared, certain knowledge that they were home. Later, he took her hand, and their arms linked, their fingers entwined. They walked inside. The fire in the hearth was burning low, a deep, steady bed of coals. Jude gently, quietly, closed the cabin door. He did not latch it. He just shut it against the night, leaving the world outside. He drew the curtain. All that was left was the soft, warm glow of the firelight and the shadow of 2 figures, moving as one. At dawn, Jude rose, as he always did. He stepped onto the porch. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and juniper. He was not alone. On the high ridge, the same one where he had first seen the omen, ghost lanterns stood. The white stallion was not a specter, but a solid, living thing. His head was up, his mane stirred by the morning breeze, and he was looking down, not at Jude, but at the valley, at the new fields, the new tower, the flowing water. He was a free thing, and he had chosen to stay. He heard Tamsin step out behind him, her feet bare on the wood. She came to stand beside him, wrapped in one of his blankets. He slipped his arm around her, pulling her against his side. "The winter is over," she whispered, leaning her head on his shoulder. He looked at her, at the woman who had faced down a judge and a gunman, who had brought life back to his canyon and his heart. He kissed her forehead. He turned and lifted her, and she laughed as he swung her easily up onto the porch rail. So she sat beside him. "The winter is over," he agreed, his voice soft. "But I still choose you, Tamsin. For this season, and for every single one to come, the sound of the new church bell, Silas's bell began to ring in the valley below, calling the town to the new day. The water from the wellspring flowed, and in the fields of Silver Mesa, the people began to plant the new season's crops. The time of revenge was over. The time of love and of building had just begun. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please share your city or country in the comments below. Join the conversation and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us extra support by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.